It's a pleasure to be here, and many thanks to the organizers of the Beijing Art and Technology Biennale. My name is Giovanni Aloi. I'm a curator, educator, author, and editor specializing in the representation of nature and the environment in art. I am the editor of Antenna, the Journal of Nature in Visual Culture, and also the co-editor of the Art After Nature series, published by the University of Minnesota Press. I publish books on the subject of the Anthropocene, posthumanism, anything to do with nature, and curate exhibitions on the same topic. Today with me, we have Mark Dorf and Paul Caradonna. Mark.
Hi, thanks again, just to reiterate, for having us here. It's such a pleasure and honor to take part in this event. My name is Mark Dorf. I'm an artist based in New York City who works with photography and video and digital media. My practice, generally speaking, is interested in humans' perceptions of what we commonly call nature and Western culture, urbanism and design, technology, and how these elements really come together to create a planetary ecology that expands upon traditional notions of the natural. Paul?
Also, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Paul Caradonna. I'm a conservation scientist based at the Chicago Botanic Garden and a professor at Northwestern University. And most of my scientific research and ecological research takes place in the Colorado Rocky Mountains at the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab. And my research group, we focus on studying the importance of species interactions, mostly between plants and animals. And we think hard about how sort of these networks of interacting species respond to change, both natural and anthropogenic. We think about that from the plant side of the equation, the animal side of the equation, and also in the context of other things like biodiversity loss.
So it's great to be here today and to be able to talk about very important and relevant themes to the Biennale, and especially to have the opportunity to talk about the work that Mark and Paul have carried out together over the past few years. In fact, shall we begin there? Can you tell us about your collaborative approach, how it came about, what brought you together?
Yeah, absolutely. So Dr. Caradonna, Paul, and I have worked pretty closely over the course of close to, actually, now I'm thinking about it, almost 10 years. It's 2014. That was the first time that we worked together. So Paul played a very key role in the production of the video that you all just saw, New Nature. It was predominantly shot and produced out at the Rocky Mountain Biological Laboratory, where Paul does his research in the summer with his lab. But what really makes our relationship unique and so fruitful is that, traditionally speaking, in my experience anyway, when an artist and a scientist works together, it's so often that one feels like it is in service of the other. You know, the scientist synthesizes something for the artist, or the artist illustrates something for the scientist. And there's, no pun intended, not always like a lot of cross-pollination that goes on there. Whereas with Paul and I, there's an immense amount of trust where, you know, at a basic level, we both understand that even just being in one another's presence really pushes forward our own pursuits, and that we learn so much from one another conceptually and ideologically and it's bound to seep into both of our works. And I think that there really is a crossover here, as opposed to A working for B or B working for A. That in and of itself, I think, is incredibly valuable and important to both of us. I mean, I won't speak for Paul, but I believe after the course of our time together, I think it's safe to say that that's true. But yeah, the voiceover that you hear, the second voiceover that you hear in A New Nature, is actually Paul. And it was taken from a conversation that we had late one night in a cabin in the Rockies. At Rumble, the Rocky Mountain Biological Research Laboratory. And we kind of, for a while at that point, I think, Paul, we had been talking about this idea of a new nature and like what this means in our current world, or what it could mean in the face of climate change, what it means within the context of the post-natural, all of these kinds of things. And so this ongoing conversation snowballed into the film that you just saw, the video that you just saw. But that conversation, that voiceover itself was very much sort of the backbone of the sort of what would become this video that you all have just seen.
Yeah, and I can sort of from my side of the equation, our initial sort of collaboration began through a program that I put together with another professor at the Rocky Mountain Biolab that we call the Art Science Exchange, which was sort of came out of a discussion with our good friend now, both of us, Dr. Nick Vauser. And we're just kind of, we enjoy sort of being out in nature, slowing down, sort of drawing a picture, whatever it is. We were commenting one day on the fact that it's such a different perspective. And at the Rocky Mountain Biolab, you have all these scientists that are approaching the landscape and the environment in a very particular way with a very particular set of tools. And even with just slowing down and drawing a picture for fun, we were commenting on how that slowing down gives you a very different take on the system we know and love, but through a particular lens. And so that was sort of, we were like, what if we had someone who could come out to the lab and just bring that perspective by being there in this community. And the Rocky Mountain Biolab, for context, is in Western Colorado. It's relatively isolated, it's relatively rustic. And so it really is like a community high up in the mountains. You're not too far away from the next ski town, but you're up there with all those people. And it's really great for just kind of being in a community and dealing with things together. So Mark came out as part of that program. And one of the key things that Nick and I were really interested in with the Art Science Exchange was creating a sort of venue and context where there could be bi-directional sharing between the sciences and the arts. And we were very adamant early on that we sort of like, well, what would be like the product of the exchange? Like we're sort of bringing out this artist, should they make something? And we decided very quickly that we didn't want there to be an explicit expectation. We wanted the art, the only expectation was the artist comes out and interacts with us and is part of the community. And basically as if they're just using their skill set in a different way in this sort of generally scientific context, but they're there as part of the community using their own tools. And the Rocky Mountain Biolab is a place where, because it's kind of a tighter knit community, was very open to this idea. And I think Mark was very welcomed and part of the community very quickly. And so just from that, I think having these discussions on hikes, having Mark come out and help with field work, but just letting the ideas flow and letting each other be influenced by one another without an expectation of like, hey, we want like a 2D image that we're going to hang in one of the buildings. It just felt kind of like that misses the entire point. And so we've just continued to keep that. First summer, Mark created his Emergence series, and that was really cool. And then years that we had talked all along about other art science ideas. And when he came back in 2021, it seemed like there was no time between when he was there in 2014 and 2021. And we just sort of zoomed out into all these conversations. And I forget how long we were overlapping there, but it seemed like it was just this continuous conversation for 2 weeks. And yeah, it was just pretty great. So we eventually recorded one of them, and those are those voiceovers, but it was very stimulating. There's all sorts of things that I feel like I've gained sort of intellectually from getting to collaborate in this capacity. And no, it doesn't produce a new scientific paper or something, or like my next grant proposal idea in a hardcore scientific sense. But that to me, I'm not interested in just like doing a new science thing. I'm much more interested in exploring that space between the two, which Mark's work is really sort of positioned right there. So
I think that's also an interesting part of the discussion that you brought into the mix, Paul, the idea of the institution and how our thinking is defined most of the time by the restrictions that the institution imposes upon the outputs, the research outputs, what we're expected to produce, and in my case, it tends to be books or essays, but yet I work with so many other media that bear no weight into the institutional calibration of internal discourses. But in science specifically, where grants are sometimes fundamental to whether research can even begin, I think that there's a different, I think it's part of that difficulty in working at the interface of art and science, because so much of it just really doesn't count in the eyes of the institution as legitimate research. And I know that things are changing, but they're changing very slowly. And I think it's interesting that scientists like you can have this enthusiasm. It's very good to see. And that you can find the strength to say, I really don't care to put out there always research with a capital R for the institution, because there's something else that's very important too in these collaborations. And I couldn't agree with you more. I wonder if we can dig a little bit deeper in the idea of what is it that art enhances about science, or what is enhanced, or what can emerge between the collaboration, between the fusion of the two, because it's not just a matter of amplifying. I don't see art as an amplifier of scientific ideas. That would be very restrictive. It's more a matter of really interlacing, jeopardizing, taking risks. There's so much more involved in that relationship, especially in the project that you worked on for New Nature. How did that play out? Tell us about the difficult moments or the happy moments, or both, whatever.
Well, I think it's interesting. I'd like to kind of mix together your previous comments in this question where, thinking about, for lack of a better term, the utility of both, right? So science tends to have a somewhat more clearer image of its use to a degree, where you create a data set, you analyze it, you publish a paper, there's effectively a better understanding of the world around us. So supposedly, right? Whereas art is a more nebulous use, where I'm by no means of the argument that art is non-utilitarian or anything like that. It makes me think about a conversation that Paul and I recently had, where what art can do that science often is unable to do is to create space for thought to happen, to create sort of potential energy for ideas to gestate, or new ideas to be produced within the space of a work of art, where a New Nature sort of gestures and creates space around an idea and provides no answers. I don't think that that's my role as an artist, is to give an answer, nor is it really, I think, the role of a scientist to give an answer per se. But one is clearly more concrete than the other, or can be anyway. So I think that that's a really unique space in my understanding for scientists to be able to enter, or it's something that is sort of getting comfortable with with not knowing, with the unknowable, in order to imagine different outcomes or applications of science, this, that, or the other thing. So I think in that regard, our relationship is quite fruitful. I mean, that's one of the examples of this cross, where I feel that becomes really active on a localized level between Paul and myself. Anyway, I can't speak for anyone else. But I think that it's a unique ability that art has, that to position in contrast to or position with science becomes really active.
Yeah, and I would add that, or from my perspective, sort of something that's really stood out to me from our last or working on A New Nature. Early on in the process, we were chatting about stuff, and I forget the particular sort of ecological concept we were chatting about. And I had made the comment, I said oh, do you think you want to make explicit statement of that, whatever, I forget what it was, but something explicit, climate change or the effect of humans or something like that. And Mark said, I'm less interested in making an explicit statement. statement. I'm much more interested in creating the space for someone, as you said, Mark, to sort of explore a set of ideas without a particular answer. And that really sat with me in that moment about the piece and what art can do on its own, and also what art can do in this sort of science art science exchange. Or it's made me think a lot about, like, a lot of times in science, we're making very explicit statements. We illustrate a figure that shows a very particular quantity of an ecosystem, something we've gone out and measured and can reproduce. And there's only so much interpretation. I mean, there always is interpretation, but it's very direct. And there's not much of it's just another fact. And that's much needed. That's an important part of the endeavor. That's how we can accumulate knowledge in a very standardized way. But it's one way of knowing. And I found that this sort of intersection with art and science opens up new doors to thinking about the things that we think we know. And I think what Mark's work has done in both previous work with emergence and in new nature has, at least in the context of the scientific community at the Rocky Mountain Biolab, but I think much more broadly, it causes people to slow down and think about, like, that's an interesting way to think about this place. And I've never thought of it that way before. And I don't think that's in the most cases going to lead to, a really prestigious paper in Nature or Science. But again, that's not what we're going for. We're trying to shift, or I think a really interesting goal is to shift perspectives. And we've had cases where scientists at the lab have sort of had quite a strong reaction to some of the work, where they've been like, that's not true, or like, that's not a real mountain, or that's a little bit deceptive, or something like that. And for me as a scientist, I was like, whoa, this is fascinating, because normally my work isn't going to have such a reaction. And this is, of course, Mark's artistic endeavor that I've gotten to play a part in. But the fact that people were responding to his work in that way, and it was kind of pushing on people to challenge some of the assumptions that they've made about an ecosystem that some people have been studying for 3 or 4 decades, seemed really valuable, that there was something there. And then on top of that, we've had examples of, just from sharing, or when people have seen the film and sort of sharing a reaction that they've, for non-scientists, where they felt like the film made them curious about engaging with ideas and concepts about, humans and nature that they were a little bit more timid to engage with. And that also felt like a really sort of a huge breakthrough, that some were saying, this made me feel like I should engage with climate change more, or the Anthropocene more. And now I was like, wow, I can't do that in science in the same way. Like, you already are on board with the information and you're like, okay, cool, it's more and it whatever, or you're against it in some way, which is not good. But, so in either way, you're not getting a lot of engagement. Whereas I think new nature really allows for that engagement without bringing a lot of baggage in. And to me, that's a huge, Mark's not communicating a specific scientific concept, but he's giving us access to explore some of these more nebulous ideas about humans' relationship with nature and what that might look like in the future. And, in closing for this, like, we can make predictions in science about what the future might look like, but it's like something about the composition of a plant community, or like how much variation we might see in an ecosystem service. And it's not about our role in nature in a sort of squishy social context, which I think is really needed right now. We kind of need that perspective to solve problems in the future. And that's very utilitarian, but that's one thing that I think some of this work helps to do by creating that space.
Yeah, I agree. There's so many interesting and important points that have been made. First of all, I'm captivated by the notion of truth in the representation of nature, because I think it's one of the most pervasive and not self-naturalizing concepts in the history of civilization. The very idea of nature as it was conceived in the West harbinges the separation between what is nature and what is culture, what is human and what is animal. And there is a naturalization of the concept of nature that I think pervades the history of Western art. For instance, there's a repertoire of images, paintings, and then again, photographs that replicate the same compositional tropes as well as aesthetic solutions that, in a sense, propose a kind of nature that is always remote, distant, that is subjugated, and that it's beautified to a certain degree. There are examples, of course, that are very famous, like John Constable, who perfected the British countryside at a time in which the Industrial Revolution was devastating the beauty of the ecological balance of the area. And at the same time, there are other very famous works by William Turner, who's still in that realm of capturing a picturesque image of nature that's, in a sense, serene and that's under human control in a way or another. And there are, we can see in these paintings implicit codes, compositional codes, use of color, use of lighting, that in a sense imply a rhetoric of supremacy over nature that is particularly Western. And I'm thinking about the point of view from which we are allowed to see certain scenes, you know, the elevated ground, as we see in this painting by Constable, the light, the sunshine towards the horizon, which invites the viewer to engage in this, with this journey from darkness to light. So there's a Christian undertone, if you like, to these images. And there is a beauty as well, that it's so pervasive in its serenity. There is a sense of calm, a sense of control. And we know, of course, that nature is the opposite of that. This vision of calm, control, and peace is the result of this fictitious separation between human and the rest of the non-human world. And more recently, I came across the work of fantastic contemporary photographer, David Bay, who made me realize through his project called Night Coming Tenderly Black, how the point of view of the Western white male has defined the conception of nature in the West, how the conception of nature itself is grounded in colonialist ideas that we now give for granted. So I think that part of what you and Mark do with this project, with New Nature, is involved in the conception of decolonization as well as deconstruction of the very idea of nature. And I think the two are intertwined. They belong to each other. You can't really do one without doing the other, or otherwise you're only doing half of the job. What David Bay did in order to break down the paradigm of the Western landscape as a vision of white supremacy was to position the viewer in, again, a speculative, fictive perspective of fugitive slaves who left the South to travel to the North, and who did so through the Underground Railroad, a set of trajectories and stops along the way that slaves could count upon for shelter. And I think that the landscapes and images of nature that David Bay captured go against the grain, go against that classical canon of the Western landscape. So there is no peace, there is no tranquility, there is no supremacy over anything, because the point of view of the camera places us in the shoes of the fugitive slave who's in fear, who fears for their lives, who are extremely vulnerable and scared, and who look upon a land that they do not own. There's this notion of ownership in the paintings by Constable, especially, and other painters who worked around that time, where the paintings are commissioned by landowners. So there's also the commoditization of land that plays into that vision of nature. And I find all of this very interesting in the context of New Nature and how deconstruction and decolonization happen. More specifically in the context of truth, because fiction is what we're working with. Am I right, Mark?
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm interested in the way in which you deploy different aesthetic languages in order to offset this tradition of the Western landscape as truth, as a given, whilst we know it's a construction. And in the process, you construct something else. Do you want to tell us how that works, how you choose your aesthetic languages and what they do?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this idea of truth in context of landscape has been one that I've been sort of thinking about for a very long time, throughout really almost all of my work for the last 10 years. It's like, so not only am I looking at this idea of nature, what we call nature in Western culture, through the lens of ecology and science, but also through technology and design. Giovanni, you just brought up, in this sort of classical history of Western landscape painting, the idea of like nature as being remote, as being separate. A new nature has a sort of funny way of both creating a fictitious version of nature that is far away and then brings it very close with some of the design elements that are brought to the forefront, where you see here an image that is close to the beginning of the video, where you're going through a fall forest, and this is actually upstate New York. This was not shot in Colorado, but you're presented with this 3D chrome sort of landscape that's constantly changing form, with all of these more formal design elements that are coming around it, or that are sort of showing up and revealing themselves around it, with this grid in the background. And all of these things gesture towards sort of interfaces or skeuomorphic buttons, or, and the sound sort of adds directly to that, where you might have different beeps and boops that sound like consumer devices or operating systems. And all of these experiences are really quite close to the human, right? But when looking at an image of sort of landscape or video of landscape, or making an image, taking a photo of landscape, you're looking through all of these different interfaces. So it suddenly becomes a collapse of space where you're both quite far away from something, and that you're romanticizing something with the filters that you put on top of the image, or the way that you edit the image, or the way that even you share the image, how the image is athletic on the internet, combined with the design elements that you're also inadvertently absorbing through the interface that you are creating the image with, or looking at the image on. I argue that this is sort of like the new pastoral, to a degree, in a lot of ways, where the interface and device on which you see the image is inseparable from the image itself. There is a collapse there in so many ways. But also, there are other, let's see, towards the end of the film, let me pull up another example. There is this sort of literal deconstruction that goes on, where all of this begins to somewhat fall apart. In the final stages of the video, this is a still from this section where Paul is speaking about our relationship with what we call nature, and how the future of nature may not be what we want, but it's something that we should prepare for. It might be the sort of grotesque version of itself. And here, through this sort of fragmentation and also compositing, so it's like both, it's kind of unclear whether things are falling apart or whether they're being added to and constructed. It's breaking down this traditional notion of the landscape image, where like here you don't see the interfaces and such, and at first glance the viewer might say, wow, this is a really beautiful, quote, natural scene, but suddenly you begin to see the hard contours, and where the images don't mix, but they seamlessly mix in other parts. And it kind of reveals that this kind of like pornographic landscape, where things do begin to fall apart, and the building blocks are revealed, but they're revealed in such a subtle way that you might miss them. So it's trying to create tension between these two worlds, and sort of both bring them together, reveal their entanglement, but also pull them apart at the same time. I mean, that's throughout a lot of my work, and especially throughout A New Nature, I'm constantly sort of trying to resolve, or maybe not resolve is not the right word. I'm trying to like make clear this tension of like fabricated reality through images in regards to what we call nature, so as to sort of gesture towards a planetary ecology that includes political systems and design and networks and the way images move through digital space and digital images themselves. All of this is really part of the same realm, which is it's not even really a future that a new nature is trying to point out. New nature is trying to point out our present in so many ways to try to create space for us to think about what the future could hold in this regard.
There's again, an interesting idea you put on the map is the notion of timelessness, which is key to the sublime essence of the sublime representations of forests, especially, and open spaces in Western art. Another device that we know separates us from nature and objectifies the landscape as something to conquer. There's, in this romantic paradigm, the way in which time and aesthetics relate is also problematized by other notions of commodity and other notions of accessibility. I think, there's something important about the elements that you use to evidence. I'm talking about I'm going to cut this out, but I'm talking about the design elements that you use in order to summon and foreground the presence of technological interfaces. And one of the things that New Nature, to me, really brought home and made even more evident is that so much of our understanding of what nature is, our conception of what nature is always mediated by some kind of technological interface. When you even think about painting, if you look at a history of technology, painting is a technology of vision. We just don't tend to, in common parlance, we don't tend to think about painting as technology because in our minds, technology is grounded in this modernist vision of mechanics. So we think about machines that move on their own, and that's when technology really starts to become technology with a capital T. But when you look at the history of technology through time and through across cultures, you can clearly see how there is very little of nature that goes beyond your first-hand personal experience. The very moment you start to communicate that experience, you can start thinking about language as technology and as an extensive, like, prosthetic tool that ties me to you. And the very moment you begin to describe this landscape to me, it's no longer that landscape, but it's my technological interpretation. And I think that very implication of what technology is also raised. It's not just what New Nature does, it's not just, of course, questioning what nature is today, but also emphasizes the role that technology has always played in the construction of nature.
Yeah, and especially not only the construction of nature in sort of a more literal sense of like creating and enforcing a binary or dichotomy between like technology and nature and seeing something as othered and different, but even in the production of the image of nature that we hold in our sort of Western understanding of what we call nature is. That was a very sort of self-referential sentence, but what I mean by that is that even throughout the history of classical landscape painting, using a technology as paint to render an image of what we call nature, to think that those images that are produced in these paintings are, quote, truthful is just wrong. These compositions were, I think it's safer to say that they were inspired by the ecological world in front of the artist, as not so much a direct reflection of it, where for compositional reasons, painters and artists would shift things around. They would dramatize things in order to create a feeling of something as opposed to a direct one-to-one reflection of it. So yes, the history of technology dating back to painting has absolutely produced the Western understanding of what we think the, quote, natural world really is. That's something that has always fascinated me, the extended definition of technology and how far can you take that and trace back to see how it still remains an influence today. I mean, that's how, we've ended up with the sort of what I called earlier, this pornographic version. That's just so extreme in so many ways. You know, you do a Google search for the Grand Canyon and you'll find images that are purple, orange, and neon blue. And it's just like clearly not the case. I mean, there's an amount of humor there.
Yeah.
But these are the kinds of images that I try to both produce and break down in my work.
Yeah, and I'll add, sort of referencing some of Mark's work from the past at the Rocky Mountain Biolab, from his Emergence series, where I was quite fascinated by the way that he tried to mimic the tools we use in science, the way we go out and sort of fracture the landscape into pieces through plots where we measure quantities of plants and animals or photosynthetic rates, and used his scientific tool, the camera, to sort of capture pieces of the landscape as images and then reassemble them in his own landscape, which is analogous to how we take all this fractured information, which is supposed to be truth, or at least that's the assumption in some way in science. And then he kind of reassembled it the same way we reassemble all these different papers and ideas in kind of a theoretical sense to sort of create this depiction of truth in nature, whether it is a mathematical theory or sort of a series of hypotheses and evidence in a certain direction. But what Mark's image here, reassemblage number 3, showed is that like this surely looks like a mountain. I think it's like the idyllic mountain that someone draws as a child. It's triangular, it's got snow. But when he showcased this at the lab, several scientists in the audience sort of objected immediately and with a strong reaction that this isn't real. This is completely wrong. This isn't from the valley. There are pieces of the mountain that are sideways. There are trees growing the wrong direction. There are duplicates of mountains in the valley on this one image here. And that reaction was quite, I found inspiring and telling that when faced with sort of this, challenging the way that we kind of assemble the world and sort of understand nature through scientific tools, when we use kind of a very similar approach, but in this way that Mark has, it reveals how this notion of truth of what nature is actually quite fluid, and it's a construct, and it's very much mediated by the tools that we use. And in the sciences, I don't think we're challenged with that as much as we should be. We use all sorts of tools. Some of it's just basic counting, and then you can use math to make sense of it. But that's still a tool that's abstracting nature and reality. So here's just an example of the scientific sort of product. These are a bunch of ecological networks depicting how species are interacting. And in many ways, in my own scientific work, we've talked about how we often are sort of, as soon as we put things together in this way, we're abstracting reality. And there's plenty of tools that we use to sort of analyze these ecological networks and understand their stability and robustness to change, but it's always some kind of abstraction, no matter how we look at it. And I don't think we're as a whole, I wouldn't say that science is particularly comfortable with sort of challenging those assumptions that we make and challenging the way in which we try and generalize and make sense of the world. And I think it's quite healthy to have sort of works that directly kind of push against that. And it's not to say that what we've been doing is wrong, but it's a nice sort of reminder that this is all an abstraction of reality in some way, mediated by sort of cultural constructs, the tools we use, and sort of the way in which we interpret them in the present moment.
It's a series of very interesting points, Paul. Since, as a scientist, you navigate a very different territory and yet one that overlaps with the artistic questioning at times. And I wonder too about the speculative dimension of what art does and the speculative dimension of science. I always find, actually, I should say, that I have encountered resistance from the sciences at times of collaboration towards the term speculative, especially. It seems to
Mhm.
be almost demonic in some circles. But at the same time, my opposition to that resistance was that science always speculates at some point and then ends up finding a path. I might be wrong on this, you can correct me, Paul. But I also feel that art, or many artists in a sense, I hate to generalize, doubles into the speculative in a more kind of like sort of pig in mud kind of way. There's a naturalness to it, especially since the end of classical Western art. You know, classical Western art was affirmative. This is Jesus. This is Venus. You know, you look at a painting and the painting does nothing but say, this is, this is. And instead, with late modern and contemporary art, we get the opposite trajectory where it's all a question and entity, like Mark was saying. I don't feel the responsibility to provide an answer, and yet, like, you know, science, maybe there is a public demand or an expectation that might be entirely wrong again. You know, what the public, what the broader audiences think about science and what it should be is very different from what professional scientists often think science should be. So I'm interested in this question of truth because I feel like art got there a little bit beforehand, that this idea that, you know, truth is a big construct that can eventually hinder our thinking and limit our relationship to the world around us. But art has more institutional license to get rid of that notion and seek freedom. Science finds different kind of obstacles in its way. And I guess what I'm interested in is the responsibility. I totally agree with Mark that perhaps modern and contemporary art doesn't have to provide an answer. It would be, it feels wrong for the times in which we live, philosophically, culturally, to say that an artist provides answers. But I feel that that pressure is still very real for scientists. Am I right? And how do you personally, in your engagement with art, negotiate this responsibility of truth in 2023? Where does it fit?
Yeah, so I mean, I don't like to sort of like I certainly put on different hats at certain times. So when I'm writing a scientific paper, there's constraints on the way in which we share and present information. It needs to be repeatable. It needs to be sort of framed in the context of the field at the moment. There's certainly speculation in the discussion part of any paper, but that's kind of a measured amount of speculation. And there are, you know, during peer review, there are many times where a reviewer might sort of slap your wrist and be like, too much speculation. And at times we push back and we're like, no, we feel like we need to point out that this is where we think this is heading, and to kind of chart out a little bit farther down the trail, like here's where we think this is going. And my own group or others can sort of help us figure out whether that's true or not, or whether that path makes sense. And I think, I mean, in some interesting ways, you know, when I'm teaching, when students are like, this proves blah, 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 you know, this proves this evidence proves this happens. I'm always like, we don't use prove in the sciences. And I think that's, in this context of thinking about truth, I think that's sort of a subtle hint that we, as scientists, we know that we're not, I think some people convince themselves that it's what they're learning is a pure reflection of reality. This is truth. And I would disagree completely that, as we've been talking about, it's one perspective on reality. And if done well and in a reproducible way, I think can shed light on the mechanisms of how things work in nature. And I think there's some truth to that, but it's mostly like, we know that things are moving in this direction over here, consistently so. And we can narrow that down and have confidence on a prediction or a forecast for the future, but we'll never really be able to put our finger on truth. And I'm not sure we have those types of discussions in science as much as we should. It's one of the things that I really like about the sort of collaboration and relationship that Mark and I have, that I get to really think with someone who is in more, I would argue, is in more of a position to explore that space. And I find that really stimulating, because I don't get to do that with my own scientific work. But I do get to do that with Mark through this collaboration. And I don't find that at odds with being a scientist. I see it as sort of a different toolkit to get at different sort of address different questions. But I will say that in terms of responsibility, as a scientist, I do have the sense that, or there responsibility comes with the role in the sense that we are trying to figure out how to fix things. You know, if we don't understand the problem, then how do we expect to fix it? And a lot of that, though, comes with like, you know, how variable are the effects of climate change or anthropogenic change going to have on human society in 10 years or 20 years? Are we going to have, you know, bumblebee pollinators in 30 years? Is my daughter going to get to experience these bumblebees? That is a major part of my research program now. And that might not be the case. And I feel obliged, and that it's my responsibility to provide some estimate of the probability of that happening or not. But at the same time, I also feel responsible, at least this is my own philosophical take, that I'm also responsible for helping people understand and appreciate the gravity of these problems in a non-scientific way, and also just appreciating the sort of the amazing beauty that's in nature, or at least beauty is one way to put it, but appreciate just whatever we want to call nature. This world that surrounds us is something worth appreciating in some way. We rely on it, we're part of it. And so some of the work that in the conversations that Mark and I have, I feel like allows me to move into that realm and, I don't know, help people make sense of nature, not just through facts, which is important in its own right. But I think there's only a subset of human society across the whole world that can actually take that information and make sense of it, even when it's boiled down to like a popular science article. So much has been lost. And in New Nature and some of Mark's other work, I feel like it's very different in its approach, but it hasn't distilled down everything to like some easy to digest nugget that pollinators are struggling or something, but it gives you sort of the vastness of the problems that we're dealing with. That sort of ability to kind of give people that space and maybe shift their perspective or relationship with nature in some way, I think is incredibly valuable. And I'd like it to be, and sort of do make it my responsibility to explore that space as well.
It's interesting, Paul, that sorry, go ahead, Giovanni.
Oh, no, go ahead.
Paul, it's interesting that you brought up this sort of like use of factual or like numbers or quantitative sort of understanding in your work, and how you said that, if I'm remembering correctly, you're saying, you know, it's not always useful. I agree with you. It's something that I strive to do in my work. Like personally, I do enjoy the sort of essayist kind of works of video and contemporary art, but that's not really what I'm setting out to do. I really want to try to push a sense of like emotional intelligence and emotional maturity towards the environments in which we live, instead of doing this sort of like fact dropping sort of finger pointing approach. You know, if you can get somebody to feel something, through image and sound, whether it be shot footage that is supposedly factual. I know we've been sort of debating this word all afternoon, but you know, something that is lens based versus something that is 3D rendered versus something that is fully abstract and 3D rendered and animated. You know, like the confluence of all of these different things, I think, is a unique power of art to sort of speak directly to this emotional response, as opposed to this sort of concrete numbers-based understanding.
Yeah,
and there's an important question here, I guess, also of translation of data, scientific data, translation of discourses that are too specialistic, or that employ language that it's too specialistic for the public, you know, broader audiences. I think all of these collaborations can really help to make something tangible. And maybe I don't even know if that's a better word, you know, in relation of the authoritative truth or something tangible. It's something that you can be empathic toward. It's something that you can grasp, in that context, which I think is very important now if we want to change the course of events and if we want to effectively motivate people. And I think it seems to me that the conversation has gone far too quickly from not caring about nature to caring about saving the planet, but we don't really understand nature. So certainly that's what's happened in the arts. I feel like for most of the Western construction of the natural world, starting roughly with the Renaissance all the way up to Romanticism, nature was made this subcategory for women to work with mostly. And it has remained so in the minds of curators and art historians all throughout the last century. There are so many artists engaging with nature, and they were all duly shoved away and hidden by art historians and curators who didn't give them the opportunity to be exhibited because the work itself was considered to be substandard. And when that process of marginalization and erasure came to an end more recently at the beginning of the new millennium, with suddenly curators realizing that climate change is a good topic to finally exhibit and focus upon, I think we just rushed to the environmental without really understanding what nature is, how we inherited this concept, where does it come from, and focusing also on plants and animals specifically. And of course, there's been quite an amount of work done in philosophy. I'm thinking of Timothy Morton, Kim Tolbert, Donna Haraway. There's a range of scholars who have actually worked very hard at breaking down this lineage and this heritage. But I feel that on the front line, in the arts especially, a lot has been missed out. And I hope that works of this kind, like New Nature, can help people slow down a little and not worry. I mean, we have to worry, of course, about the state of the planet, but simultaneously, we have to re-educate ourselves about what is nature and how is the relationship between us and nature being defined by rhetoric and philosophical ideas that are now outdated for the planet we live upon.
The tools we use to make sense of nature, truth or not, and predict the future, however accurate, have nothing to do with sort of our emotional relationship with nature, especially, as you put it, Mark, our emotional maturity with nature. And I think that's a really, also Giovanni sort of getting at this point of maybe we've moved a little bit too fast, or the arts have moved too fast. But I think that's a really important point to make. And I like to think that Mark's work gets at that and sort of puts us in the position to consider where are we with this relationship? What might it look like in the future? And as I believe it says in the film, I can't exactly remember the specifics now, we can't break up with nature. We're stuck with it. And I don't think we spend enough time thinking about, whether this relationship is one that's emotionally mature. And I think thinking about that more and sort of grappling with that challenge and creating the space to think about that is incredibly important.
Well, thank you, everybody, for this really interesting and informative conversation. And it's been a pleasure, again, to be part of this symposium. And we hope that these conversations will continue thereafter. Thank you.